Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. John Douillard. Welcome to the LifeSpa podcast. And today we have a really special guest. Her name is Durga Leela. She's the author of this amazing book. And if you can see it, it's called The Yoga of Recovery, Integrated Yoga and Ayurveda with Modern Recovery Tools for Addiction. Durga is a certified Ayurvedic practitioner, yoga teacher, and yoga therapist. Based here in the US, she serves as the director of Ayurvedic Programs of the Shivananda Ashram in California. She's been doing that since 2003, and she's a professional member of the National Ayurvedic Medical Association, as I am as well. I've known Durga for quite a few years, I think now, and she's got an amazing story to tell about addiction, her own personal journey, and she's woven the Ayurvedic principles, which are so profound, into this amazing book as a guide that she calls the Yoga of Recovery. And it's really good. So Durga, welcome. It's really great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be here with you, John.
You're very welcome. So you start the book by talking about, which I love. It's so funny because I have just been writing this article about what Ayurveda calls the cause of disease, which we call pragya prad, which means the mistake of the intellect, sometimes talked about as crimes against wisdom and things like that. And as I was reading your book, I was going, oh my gosh, that's exactly where you started. Your book was talking about how Ayurveda really talks about the fundamental imbalance is a spiritual issue. It's not a physical issue or a disease issue. It's a spiritual issue. So I thought we could start there and tell us a little bit about how addiction is a spiritual concern more even than a physical or a disease issue that we talk about in the West, right? Everybody gets really in the West, they like to say, "Oh, this is a disease," right? But Ayurveda is like, well, wait a minute, let's think about this as a memory loss between your true nature and this version of ourselves that we project on the screen that we hope people will like, right? Something along those lines. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, and you put it so well. How I feel about it is that mistaken identity. And a book that I love, Meditation and Its Practices, Swami Adiswarananda talks about our habitual self-forgetfulness. So for me, even as a young child, that felt like a pain place to live from. And it was like being taught, like educated, and also in a religious education, it still felt like, why is no one explaining these things that happen that seem so hurtful? Like we can barely get over them. Like at 5, I had lost my father, which in truth didn't affect me that much. But my mother had been left with 5 children, aged between 3 and 9 years old. And it affected her a great deal. And I was receiving all her grief and emotion and concern and worry from that young age. And so I think this real subtle and spiritual level, like we can say, yeah, that's my karma. Like I was born into that family. And so some of my spiritual lessons, therefore, were this, and it's mentioned a lot of how much we take on a subconscious level, like prior to 6 and 7 years old, from the emotional soup that we're in as children, all the motor neurons, all the like feeding and being around the mother and the family. So I think that is a big part that arises within the addictions, because we see it as the big question of nature and nurture. There's this huge statistics that I think it's 50% of children from alcoholic homes will become alcoholic themselves. So this intergenerational nature, and also what we're looking at now, intergenerational trauma. So this aspect of the seed cause, which I think is part of that, the way I understand that spiritual aspect, that seed aspect of the life force and its connection to our ancestors.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's those studies on, in Ayurveda we call them the samskaras, the impressions, right, from our ancestors. And studies now show that stress, trauma, famine, things like that from 2 or 3 generations ago will actually affect the genetic code and how it's expressed, in our lifetime today. There's that great study with rabbits, right, where they had a rabbit and they kept, every time they have them smell peppermint, they give them a little prick with a needle, and the rabbit would learn very quickly that just a little bit of smell of the peppermint would freak him out. And then the rabbit had babies, and when the babies grew up, all they needed is 1 whiff of peppermint, and they were instantly freaking out, as if they got pricked, right? So we pass that. It makes sense, right? You pass that stress as a genetic safety valve to make sure that we're equipped to handle that stress down the road. And that's what we do. And we pass it on for 3 generations. So if you have a history of alcohol abuse or trauma of any kind, then this gets passed on, and it becomes part of our work. I love the old saying. One of my favorite sayings, Vedic sayings, is that if something, to the extent that something affects you, is to the extent that it is your karma. And karma obviously means action. So to the extent something affects you, or to the extent someone affects you, to the extent that it is your karma, therefore your action, therefore your opportunity to take transformational action and free yourself. So it comes to you as an opportunity. So when your dad passed away and your mom didn't handle it very well, obviously you handle that by creating patterns of behavior of survival as a young child. But then at some point, you have the opportunity that Ayurveda says we become conscious and realize that those patterns serve me for a spell, but now I have to free myself from those old patterns of behavior and let who I truly am out. And you did that, which is amazing. And I think that's I love to, if you don't mind sharing more about that, because I feel like that's what Ayurveda, I talk a lot about that. What Ayurveda is about is becoming conscious, right? But you can't become conscious unless you're aware of the fact that you're unconscious. So there must have been some point in there where you went from going I'm unconsciously just drinking because my mom did it and I did it, and I'm just, self-medicating. And at some point you woke up and you had you realized that somehow glimmers of consciousness started to kind of seep into your awareness, and you made the change. What was that first awakening of becoming conscious, and how did you go there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one to really grab a hold of that thread, because I would describe my life as, definitely both always at the same time conscious, but unable to bring forth action that supports this consciousness that I am, too entangled with the victim narrative or the suffering narrative, but always a little bit of both. We talk about this system of balance. And so when I think of this level, I do think of the gunas, and I know that's how we in Ayurveda look at the psychological and the spiritual nature. So I definitely had an awakeness about me, but also my perspective on what I was awake to was, and I'm going to say it was a life where we didn't really talk about, to me, fundamental or existential issues. How do you expect me to succeed in this life when I already know we're going to die and it's all going to go to nothing? So I had that kind of nihilistic viewpoint, right. I think almost since the age of 7 or 8, and I will say that one of my early childhood diseases was asthma. And so it was also playing out in my body, the inability to take a free breath, without some pain or get anxiety feeling. So when I look back to all that, I just think, wow, it's so amazing how they are co-arising together. This deep karmic narrative story and the perspective of the mind and all the physical symptoms of the body, but also the relatedness that we're picking up, these signals of what it means to belong. Because what will I say? There was a great amount of codependency in my circle. So even the spirituality as religion was given as a kind of fear-based, sin-based, you'll go to hell if you do this. And so like that was constraining my idea of like this conscious awareness that there's something more than this short-lived experience. And just the idea of the kind of punitive measures. If you don't get this right, this is going to happen. So that was a bit of like the community I lived in. And, it was in Scotland. It was a Catholic education. It was, you need to be educated to just even make it in this world. But again, part of my view was like, but the people who are educated aren't that happy either. And the religious people don't seem that happy. So like, and I guess a lot of my issue was being told to do something whilst the adults who were telling me were actively not doing it, themselves. So like this discordant idea between here's the truth and then here's the reality of, illusion, delusion, lies that we're actually living. So from a young age, that bothered me. And so I will say that once I found yoga, and it was really the yoga of knowledge, the Vedanta, that was, I describe it as my first drink, because there was an existential aspect to my addictiveness that like the whole success and material setup that you were giving me as my life moving forward just seemed kind of ludicrous to me. And so I needed something much more eternal. And if I can sum that up, I always had an issue with time. It seemed to me there was nothing that you could hold on to. Everything was so transient, so changing, so fleeting that like when I was young, if it was coming to Christmas, I would get myself too worked up. And so I would bring on like an ear infection or an asthma attack because I was so excited that a fun, like happy time was coming. So I'd make myself sick. So the doctor said she gets too excited. And so therefore I missed a lot of the happy times by the anticipation of them. But also if I made it to the happy time, I was already processing that there was only 4 hours left. There's only 2 hours left of this. And then I have to go to bed and it's all over. And I really see that part of my mindset being a large part of my own addictiveness. And here's another thing that, and this really helps me understand, especially from that young perspective of like those like imprints of addiction in our samskaras. When I said we had our mother, and she was an excellent mother, she really provided for us. She put us before everything else. And there was 5 of us. And as we grew into adulthood, and by the time I was 32, my mother had died. And I say her death was brought on rapidly by alcoholism. But my brothers and sister don't always agree with me, which is amazing to me. But the yoga story with the elephant, and the blind boys go to see the elephant and they all describe the elephant differently. Like one has felt the elephant at the trunk and one's felt the elephant at the tail, and they're blind. So they're given the description, and there's all these different descriptions according to where they were standing and feeling into the elephant. And I think it's interesting because we talk about denial being the elephant in the living room. And so it took me many years to understand that my perspective on the disease of alcoholism that I was growing up with, it was a very different perspective from my brothers. And, I heard you talking about healing in space recently, but the field of my family home was my 3 brothers shared a room. I shared a room with my sister. She ran away from home. So I was in that room alone. And so therefore, when my mother was drunk, she would come and visit me in my room. So I had it very up close and personal. And it's taken me a couple of decades to realize my brothers didn't get that nighttime alcoholism face of my mother, which was sort of demonic, So we have such a different perspective on it. And that's playing out on some kind of hunger I had for something lasting. And so because it wasn't lasting and I could kind of see that in a rational way, then I tended to reject it. There's no point in that because it's not lasting. So therefore, yoga was such a gift that I could live here in this sphere because it gave me the eternal. Does that sound strange?
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. It seems like the yoga was something that gave you, it'll tell me if this makes sense to you, that it gave you a level of self-awareness. And the self-awareness started, like you said, you kind of were on one hand conscious, and on the other hand, you weren't conscious. Like you sort of knew at some point that this lifestyle wasn't sustainable, yet at the same time, you would still go and do those things. So you had like, we know there's door number one, which is go get drunk. And there was door number two, which is this is crazy. I can do something different. I can let who I am out. I can stop numbing myself, and I can start taking the risk to be vulnerable, the risk to be, Durga, the risk to be me, and be vulnerable and sensitive and all that. So there's that back and forth. You bang your head against the wall, get drunk, and you go, God, that's so stupid. And you feel remorse the next day. And we bang our head against the wall a lot, for years sometimes, until finally you go through that door number two and you go, all of a sudden you start laying down new neural pavement where it's almost easier to go down that new road. And obviously yoga gave you that, right? Gave you that, like, this is a yellow brick road. I could go down this road, and I'm a little bit more enjoying this road than what my mind said. I ought to get the juice and the stimulation that you talk about in your book from the alcohol, but it wasn't sustainable. So, after a while, you beat your head against the wall, you realize that I got to do something new. And that, I feel like, is when you become conscious. You become like, oh, and you start realizing that, all that before was just me, self-medicating to just numb myself from pain. And Ayurveda, one of my other favorite sayings is that, the pain is directly across from the bliss. And the reason for the pain is to get your attention. You can go to the pain, through the pain, then access who we truly are, and then let it out. And I feel like, I guess, is it true? We just, if you're addicted, you just have to keep banging your head against the wall and feeling the pain until you finally go through it. And is there a way to accelerate that process where you can, get to that window where you can see door number one and door number two a little bit quicker and move through that pain with a little bit more guidance? And maybe that's what the yoga of recovery is really all about, right? Maybe give people that heightened, quicker, faster level of self-awareness where they can realize that this is something way more on the other side of this than the numbing of my pain.
Yes, definitely. And I think the different ways to do it, I guess what I found was that the options presented to me were sort of limited. I remember being in school and they sort of said to me, you're either going to go do this or do that. And once you go to like further education, you can be like a nurse, a teacher, a doctor, and everything seemed like this short list. And yet when I went out into the corporate world, for instance, people had jobs that I thought, well, how did you get that job? Like, one of them came in as the head of altruism in my corporate company. And I'm like, how did you even know there was such a job? Like, your job is to give the corporate money away to good causes. Meanwhile, I'm working in the accounts department. So it seems like the light on the potential in my younger life was quite kind of dim. And it was spotlighted into, here's the areas where you're going to survive. So I think there's an aspect of, and I think it has been any culture that's been through, trying to make it at a material level, trying to recover from some of these like huge traumatic rifts that have been caused by war and loss at a bigger cultural level, that they need to reestablish material success, feeling okay at that level. And not much can be given attention-wise to beyond that. And I say that because I also work in Vietnam with Swami Sita, and I see that same thing there, that there a couple of generations beyond such a major event, you start to get this impact of like the frozen feelings kind of thawing out. But it might not happen within one generation, which is amazing to me. But I think there's what Ayurveda and yoga have taught me is that it's not this single lifetime that we're working at healing, even as an individual. Like our individualness is perhaps the biggest illusion, like this myth of separation is the biggest illusion. So I consider all the healing that I'm doing heals my mother, and it also heals some of the generations coming, so that the idea of everything that we're doing today is going to affect both like the past and the future, because this aspect of time is not quite what we think it to be. But talking about that in our society too, we have for too long given too short a time for people to heal from addiction. And we also really concentrate on the identified patient. Like, you are the person with the addiction, and it's usually to do with alcohol and drugs. Whereas we are like, society norms is addiction. And we've been raised into like really, I don't know for how many decades or generations, raised into this like real individual life. Like, you alone are the person that needs to succeed, not as part of this family, as part of this community, but you as the individual. And I think that fundamental like forgetting of our collective nature has been a wound to almost everyone here living this experience now. So somehow we need to get back to the collective nature. And I think Ayurveda shows me that collective nature by the connection to nature. That, you know, the fact that I look out into my backyard and see the 5 elements and understand myself to be those 5 elements, that gives me a continuity of self and of presence. And I also love, like, I love your book 3 Season Diet, because it gives me that patterning with these great rhythms. And before that, I was typed way too small, like these little limited types. I am a female, I am Catholic, I am like Irish, Scottish, you know, like some of these are like sentences upon themselves. So I needed to kind of shake off some of those shackles. And I really do feel Ayurveda gave that to me. Ayurveda, the word Ayur, really, it gave me life. Whereas before, I kind of was trapped into this conditioned consciousness. And it was a jacket that never really fit that well.
Yeah, I think you're so right. You know, when you talk about how our culture has become so individualistic versus community-based, and you know, young kids come out of high school or college, and all of a sudden they're on their own to make it or break it, and it's really tricky. And there's some really interesting studies based on a study with magpies, the birds, right? And they had a locked cage of food, and they had one magpie trying to open up this cage, and they couldn't really do it. They couldn't figure it out. So they let like about 10 magpies come, and in short order, they figured out how to open the cage. So it was, and then they went back to the anthropology, and they looked at what event tripled our brain size. And people say it was cooking, it was meat, it was fire, it was fishing, it was so many theories. But what they're actually thinking now is that it wasn't any of those individual events. It was actually coming together as community, as opposed to small little individual tribes coming together, becoming bigger tribes. That group consciousness is actually what actually tripled our brain size, because we, just like the magpies, we're smarter together than we are alone. And I think that's really important, and probably a big part of why people get addicted, because they feel alone. And alcohol or drugs or whatever is like you're not as lonely for the moment, And I think that's something that's really important. And you talk about 3 different ways that we can sort of unravel this in the beginning. One was the misuse of our senses, crimes against wisdom, and the effect of time and evolution. You already touched on that a little bit. But I'm curious if you go through that from the addictive perspective, because those are the 3 major rules Ayurveda that are related to the cause of disease. But let's let's talk about that from the addiction perspective.
Yeah, and that is like, there's 2 parts to my book. I concentrate on the constitutional aspect, because that allowed me to feel part of the greater whole. And then that cause of disease was a huge shift moment for me. And I did hear Mark Halpern give that talk at the California ashram, and it really did change my life. So who I was at that point was I was a person in a 12-step fellowship and getting sober using the 12 steps of, and I'll break my anonymity, Alcoholics Anonymous. But I was kind of perplexed about how was it that I was the one that had this spiritual malady and nobody else did. And I was the one that had to really retrain all my thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, and no one else did. So why me type of thing. So when I heard it, for instance, the forgetting our true nature is spirit, that placed me back into, it gave me the eternal, where I was kind of outraged by the transience of everything. There was nothing solid that you could hold on to. There was no security. Yeah. And then I'll go with that crimes against wisdom piece, because that was huge. Because I was sitting in a program that kept telling us we had to believe in God or a higher power. And so there's a lot of debate about who that higher power is. And are we being prescribed religion? And I never had a problem with an idea of higher power, because I always kind of felt that there was some kind of cosmic intelligence in the universe. But phrasing it as crimes against wisdom to me then just said the wisdom is in here. It's not out there. It's not in somebody's culture or particular religious perspective. The wisdom is living me. And so therefore, had I experienced that? Yes, because just like you said, I'm making a decision that's against my own wisdom. I'm doing something that I don't really want to be doing, and I know it won't really work, but I can't really stop myself. If it wasn't for the wisdom within us, there wouldn't be the suffering. If I found heroin, for instance, and it gave me a good feeling, then everybody plus myself would support me saying, hey, that works for you, go ahead, have a ball, enjoy yourself. And, maybe you'll end your life early, but it doesn't matter. Why would it matter if it wasn't for the wisdom that is living us? And so that's important for me as I work with anybody with addictiveness, because there's always that slight chink of their own light that is saying this isn't the solution. But a lot of their attention is on the pain. So what they are doing is like first responder remedies for pain, especially from the environment that we live in, which is individualistic and consumer, but also conformity. If you tell me these things will make me happy, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to go out and get them. And if they don't make me happy, you're going to diagnose me with anxiety or depression. Well, what if our whole lifestyle is broken? What if our whole aspirational, this is what we should be going for in life? What if that's broken? And I think a lot of younger children, teens maybe, in this generation are kind of witness to that. If this is the trajectory that you say will bring me happiness, why are you all so heavily medicated and diseased? I mean, it's a question. I went out to teach to Friday Night Live, which is the youth group of California. And those youngsters ask that sort of question, if this is the way we're supposed to live, why are you all so unhappy? And that was part of the questioning that was arising within me. So the wisdom was there. There's well, wait a minute. Plus then me as an individual, my mother told me I should marry someone rich, the male-female thing. And I remember saying to her, you know what, Mom, I'm just going to get rich myself so I don't have to get married. Why would I need to get it through someone else? And so that's also that's a yoga pathway, the bhakti compared to the jnana yoga, the direct path, or, the path that involves someone that's more like a middleman, a priest, a pujari, someone that you interact with. So these options were not, they weren't revealed to me. And then misuse of the senses, I have to say, I think that's an obstacle right now, especially because we have kind of named addiction as a relationship, a pathological relationship with one substance or behavior. But when you look at us as 5 sense beings, and we're operating and interacting with our world through all the five senses and all the organs of action, we have many ways to express our, like, what we call acting out, what we call our unwholesome conjunction of the senses with the objects of their affection, like this sense affairs that we're having. So a couple of things I think the conversation in yoga recovery helps people is that we use a phrase called the spread addiction. And it's hard to pin, like a younger person, for instance, sometimes it's harder to say this person is an alcoholic because they don't fit that. They turn to alcohol for all the pain and suffering that they're feeling. They are turning to cannabis. They've got some pill popping, they've got some over exercising and restrictive eating habits. They've got, definitely the media addictions, the internet, the relationship addictions, sex, love, romance. And it kind of depends who they're hanging with, what day of the week it is, what season it is, as to what one is like happening. So instead of drug of choice in yoga of recovery, we're calling it spread addiction, but also distraction of choice. But we're trained into distraction. So it always interests me that, like, we know there's anger is an issue. So we have anger management classes, and we know stress contributes to disease. So we have stress relief techniques. But we have attention deficit disorder. But no one really emphasizes how do you train attention. And attention, like there was this lady from Ions who I heard at the ashram down in the Bahamas, and she talked about 4 things that are really important to make any spiritual experience sustainable. And she says intention, attention, repetition, and guidance. And those 4 words really, really guide me. Like, I need to set my own intention to, find ways to be creative, because my action can either heal or harm. And I need not just one way given to me. I don't need a food list. I need to pay attention to the planet and her seasons, for instance, where your book gifted me with being part of this rhythm and cycle. And that allows me to deal with the transience, because it's not an end, it just brings something new, especially now we're in like this particular fall season. And I see the beauty of the newness of the season, not always grieving the end of summer. So there's a perspective there. So this idea of the timing, the being involved in, all of that has just really helped me. So the time aspect, I would say, is also one of the most helpful things, because especially in early recovery, you might wake up in the morning and you think you're doing okay. And we call the Vata time the crash and crave time. And like, it's a time where you just think, it's what catastrophizing thinking comes in. Like, I just can't get through another day of this. I'm never going to be able to make it. I'm always going to be in this struggle. And so realizing that would come upon me, I'd look at the clock and I'd say, oh, there you go, it's 3 o'clock or it's 2 o'clock. And, that is the Vata time of day. This is a 4-hour period. What can I do to get through this particular period in this day? Because there's the long-term building of those daily routines and habits. And I think you are probably one of the people that's helped me with that the most in your writings, just the idea of those rhythms through the day. And we live one day at a time in recovery. And so one day at a time, according to the dosha times, that begins to really help us. So I made the Vata time of the day the time that I would just give up on all the ambitions and all the lists of things that I had to do. And I would just get my dog and go for a walk. And I'd just sit and I'd take in the sights and sounds of nature and walk along with her for an hour. And that would change my whole day. But, it's that idea that I can be well 1 minute and then the next minute, suddenly I'm not well. Like the really volatility, which I think is the rajas in the mind. Like catastrophizing is probably a good way to put that. And It's a difficult place to be, for sure. So I think our times of day will really help people, and not just, especially in early recovery, but not just early recovery. It helps us get a perspective on where we are, because even as we age, there could be that looking back, thinking, we've missed out on things. That's another big aspect that we're dealing with. Like, because I wasn't present to my life and the people around me, I've missed my childhood, my own children growing up. Like, this is the actual things we face. So I'll stop there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I love it. You mentioned earlier on that there was an awareness, an awakening, that you realized that your actions were affecting, your mom, who's your ancestors now in the past, but it's also affecting the future. And I wonder, was there a time when you realized that, that you, Durga, were both this physical body having this experience, but you're also the spiritual body having this experience, and that spiritual body was beyond space and time. It was, this whole time thing was completely, as you said, not quite understood by us. And that awareness that you're just as much spirit as you are physical, did that give you a sense of, like, wow, I'm a spiritual being, and that there are ancestors that are in spirit, and that somehow allowed you to realize that there was a spiritual awakening that allowed you to kind of wake up and realize that I am just numbing myself from my truth. And my truth is that I'm so connected to this incredible infinite world of vibration, frequency, spirit. And I don't have to I'm not alone. I have something, a relationship with a higher power, or with spirit, that somehow is kind of reeling me in from the wasting of my life. Did that happen to you?
I love that question, and we need a few more hours for that conversation. But yes, it definitely happened, and it was little moments of realization, little moments of clarity that would come through, and I had those quite profoundly in my early recovery. I've had them quite profoundly when I go in and do sustained practice. Like, you're aware of the teacher's training course that I did in the Shivananda organization. So when I put myself into something that, I'm going to say, sometimes feels relentless, you're on this disciplined schedule and you've got to show up, and you're doing it even when you don't want to do it, then it breaks through some of those ego boundaries, and I get glimpses of something bigger. I get it, especially when, I'm going to say, you force me to go to long pujas and rituals. Not you, John, but like the environment that I'm in, and I have this like desire not to do it, and I have a resistance against it. And yet oftentimes that's the time where something kind of profound or more connected to the non-physical beings that are there in my support, they get their message to come through to me. So I have a thing that probably started it all, that when I was a practicing alcoholic and I went to France to celebrate my friend's birthday, and I'd been there before at her mother's place, and I knew it was near Lourdes, and I grew up as a Catholic, and my mother's name was Mary, and we were always raising money so people could go to Lourdes for healing. So I had one day where it was just me and my friend and her mother, and they said, is there something you want to do? And I said, well, why don't you take me to Lourdes? I hear it's close by. And they said, really? You want to go to Lourdes? And I was like, I do, actually. Yeah, it's something that I'd like to see. So I went there, and my mother was, as far as I was concerned, ill with alcoholism. She was in a wheelchair by then, having been knocked down in the street trying to make it to the liquor store, drunk. And so I lit the candle, And by this time, I have no relationship with Catholicism, but here I am. And I often say in yoga recovery, remember, some of our most profound moments are going to happen when we pray to the God that we don't believe in. And so I lit this candle and, I'm trained in prayer, being a Catholic, but nothing came to me. So I just said, relieve her of her suffering. And my miracle was she died the next day. And that was not a happy miracle for me. Like there was a time lag for me to realize what a miracle of release that was. And so, like, did I cause my mother's death? I don't mean it like that. I don't mean magical thinking, but it was this act that I did to like pray for the release of the suffering she was in. I did not expect death to be the solution. And then when I was there in early recovery, and I honestly say I was vacuuming, I could see the place where I was standing, and a song came on, and it was Ave Maria. And as that song came on, I got like a little download of little parts of my life, and I understood my whole connection with my mother. It was like that. Like I had a partner once, and he had a car crash, and he said it was almost like little frames of my life all came in front of me, and I could see like my life in all these like frames. And that was something that I experienced, and it explained to me, and it connected her role and my role with each other, like really as teacher. And some of these lessons aren't that pleasant, I guess. But the other thing that I want to say is, and especially around the conversation that's going on right now, if you want to bring in some of those more profound and subtle and spiritual connected moments, and you want to bring that to the consciousness, we sometimes call it intuitive moments. I think the access point is the breath. And I think it's a little difficult that because we work with a biochemical model, that because their drugs don't work right now, especially for their diagnosed conditions, which I think are also questionable, like the DSM and the way it does mental health conditions is highly questionable. And then the solution that's offered, like a chemical response to imbalanced chemicals in the brain, as almost like a full solution, that seriously should be questioned. But what we're doing now is we're moving towards like psychedelic assisted treatment and stuff, whereas yoga moves towards the subtle assisted treatment, which to me, I have had almost reliably connected experiences using the breath. And I'd say more the cathartic breathing, not like the daily pranayama, which gives me a constant like plug-in source connection, but the profound like mind-blowing connections have come with things like the rebirthing breath and the transformative breathing. And I've seen those done in rehabs. And what's interesting is there's usually a waiting list for them. People want to have that experience. So I thought, just hearing you recently, and I gotta say this because this is just brilliant. The diaphragm is the muscle of immortality, is what you said in the last conference I heard you speak of. And like that is amazing, because that practice of pranayama is going to give us the access to this very subtle understanding that we call sattva, so that we won't be fooled by forms, so that we won't be stuck in this like subconscious patterning and conditioning that would hold us like in a cage, in a dungeon, like a prisoner of our own making, which is a lot of what addiction is. Like we say it's like self-will run riot. We say it's the prison that's self-created. And so imagine if your key in the door truly was just your own breath, free, always available. Like no one controls it. No one can take it away from you.
I 100% agree. And it's one of the reasons why I've been writing so much about breathing and doing videos about different breathing techniques. And I think that the reason why, the big, cathartic breaths and so on, the rebirthing breath and Bastrika and all that, I do think that what they can do is they can create a state of being where the mind stops thinking. And then if you take that if you take that breath down, the next step is you have to take that breath down to the subtle, to the most subtle, to the most subtle. And that's the thing, is like when you think about thinning the veil between spiritual and physical, right? And assuming that if you had, an awareness that you were also spiritual and physical, and you had all these spirit guides and angels and this whole spirit world, if you believe in it, is here supporting you, and here you are being sort of like wasting your life with alcohol or with drugs or whatever, you kind of like go like, wow, there's a whole world out there for me in the spirit world that I can explore, and realize that this is the human potential is so unlimited, and I'm doing it, with a bottle of vodka. It's crazy. So it's sort of like, I really feel like that spiritual, like, and I think that's why 12 steps is sort of a very, spiritual or religious or God oriented, is because you really, that belief in a higher power. But in Ayurveda, it's not a belief in higher power, it's an experience of higher power, as you said. And the breath is the key. And I think that's where, coming down to that subtle, 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 subtle breath, where you're really beginning to be aware. In Ayurveda, we always say that the more subtle it is, the more powerful it is. And that's what the breath does. And I think that's what you're saying. And I think that's a really great point, is that for people to, use the breath to begin to thin that veil, so they can begin to have a relationship, whatever they want to call it, a higher power, their spirit world, their ancestors. Different cultures had an ancestor relationship. Some had, gods, like in Ayurveda, many gods, and some are just, Jesus and Mary and Catholicism, whoever, it doesn't matter. But it does matter that you have an experience of it, not just a belief of it. I think that really helps people, because the people, like you said, like you guys all went to church and you did all this stuff and you're miserable and you're on all these drugs. Like, why should I do that? Why, it doesn't make any sense. I'm young. I'm not going down that road. But I think what you're talking about with the yoga recovery is taking people down a road where it's not just a yoga of recovery, it's sort of yoga of awareness, and a road of waking up to the truth of who they really are. And then from there, like, you're not longing for a spiritual experience to wake you up and heal you. It sort of just becomes a knowing that you are really not in this alone, where you are really a spiritual being having, this physical ride. And I think that's the beauty of what I think the yoga of recovery does. And you work with people, right, to help guide them through these experiences and guide them through. Do you work individually with people?
I do. I work individually with people. For years, I've run retreats and courses at ashrams, because again, I think the environment of like having the full support of the place and the others, the other teachers, the swamis, even the food and the setting of the place and the company of each other, that's important. And then I also take people over to India to do the Pancha karma. And I think that's a ongoing sort of relapse prevention. And we have this thing in recovery, and it comes from 12-step model, which is to me, one of the ways that they are speaking to sattva, and they say more will be revealed. That the more you continue on this path, then it's like you will understand more as you go, which to me is tuning to the subtle. And I think like one of the things that I really noticed with our culture is that we think advance is getting our needs met and then getting our greed met, in the sense of like, there's certain base things that you need, and hopefully our society structures would help you achieve those. That's questionable, especially when you add punitive measures to people who suffer with addiction, like the criminal justice system and things. So, but then like we've got our needs met, and then we think in advance on that is like getting a designer car or getting like designer clothes, and it's just clothes, But if I spend all my prana energy trying to get the upgrade on the material things, then like a lot of us exhaust ourselves in that level of living. And then we kind of wake up at some point and think, well, that hasn't worked. And I think that ties into a lot of what we see, which is the one addiction process and how it can relate to anything. It can relate to me having a beautiful body so I can go out and be, sexually and romantically attractive to others, which is the people addictions or the work addiction, where I give all my time and energy over to work because I want the money for the status, for the, in 12 steps, we call it power, property, prestige, that those can be addictive pathways in and of themselves. So we've got to like internalize this attention within ourselves, and that experience of higher power will be like revealing itself continuously. And I do also want to make a distinction that I think we have the tamas effect to start with, that heaviness, that darkness, that stuckness, that lethargy. So I think there is different levels of treatment needed. And I think the journey towards the subtle has to come from like a very active state. So therefore, like when we talk about the cathartic breathing methods, I think they help shift the tamas. So I think they're good in a rehab setting, but whether you would need to put that in as a lifestyle practice, like every single day of your life, no, I think that's more the pranayama practices. But it does take a bit of being able to sit still. It takes a bit of being able to actually sit with yourself. And so therefore, in tamas, we often say you need a lot of strict supervision. Like this is where like the hospital or the rehab is going to come in. Whereas in Rajas, you need a lot of community support. Because I'll be honest with you, even after I'm now 22 years sober, there's certain things that I will do for myself. And then there's other things that I still need the support of signing up for the course. Somebody's going to take attendance, or I paid my money and so therefore I should go. And then I've also met some people and I'm interested enough in that, social aspect as well. And then for me, what is sattva, and we said this is the more subtle realizations and experiences, that sattva is when you can self-initiate more of your own practices, and you can self-initiate them from that awareness that you have of what your need is today, how your internal system is, and not from this noise of what you should be from the external, the advice, and so I am really interested in that journey, and I'm aware of how it changes. But one of the things that I will admit that I often need a yoga class to take me through the discipline of a 60 or 90-minute practice, because left to my own devices, 20 to 30 minutes is about all I can put in for yoga, like on my own mat, under my own teacher's guidance. And I just accept that about myself. Like it's even during COVID times, I'm trained as a yoga teacher. I know how to go through my 12 asanas and my pranayama and my shavasana, but I'll skip bits and I'll cut the time down. So it helps me to show up and have the support of a teacher. And other people have different things. Maybe it's their diet, maybe it's their food choices, maybe it's their, other habits and behavior. But I think we run between those. We can self-initiate. We need social, we need support. And some of us, we need strict supervision, even in recovery.
Yeah, I think, what you said is really important. The journey isn't just from getting out of, addictive behavior. The journey starts from sattva when we're born, which was, free to just love and give and be free. And then our senses kick in and we start realizing we can get toys from the outside world. We can get people to like us, approve us, and appreciate us. So that's rajasic behavior. And then after we be overstimulated and we become exhausted in that search for getting satisfied from the outside world, sensory stimulation overload, we find ourselves sometimes numbing ourselves from the world because it's overwhelming. And that's what we call tamas. And what you're talking about is the journey is to go from tamas back to rajas, back to sattva. And how, tamas is like being a little bit in the mud and you need a little bit of help getting out of there. And that's where I think doing all of this or any of this in an ashram setting where the food is sattvic, which means pure, clean, organic, The environment is pure. People are meditating, they're yoga, breathing. Everybody there in the ashram is on the journey of feeling safe in that environment to let something really delicate out, their sensitivity be exposed. And in that environment, I think, we can find our way out of that cocoon of tamas, emotional blocking and numbing, and find our way back into the world of tamas, where we can see the difference between being stimulated by the outside world or being attracted to that place on the inside, which very few of us are going. Because why should I go on the inside when I have a cell phone and tells me everything I need right here? Boom, I can do anything in a second. Why go in? It's crazy. This is instant, So we're really challenged these days. But I just wanted to point out that that's the journey you're talking about. And then, taking these people in retreat in an ashram is really beautiful. And then teaching them these tools of self-awareness so they can begin to realize not a mindset of like, I think that like the thing about, and I want to ask you this, like the whole 12-step thing is like, you're an addict and you're going to be an addict and you're going to carry that label and the shame along with being addict for the rest of your life. And there's something from the Ayurvedic perspective, I think, is way more than that. You're not an addict. You experience addict behavior. You're a being of light and you're full of love. But for some reason, your mind chose that it wasn't safe to let that love out. So I became X. I experienced X, but I'm not damaged forever. It's almost like, I was Catholic, raised Catholic too. It's like, there was some there were bad places you would go if you stole cookies from the cookie jar, you know what I mean? And so I think that, I wonder what you think about that, like those labels that we put on people, do they ever go away, in the world of being an addict?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it's something that continuously comes up. And the way I bring the clarity that I have now understood about it is, when I was a practicing alcoholic, it was the one thing that you could not know about me. It was the one thing, and I think tamas is secrets, lies, hiding, shame, and guilt. And so
Beautiful.
I've learned to put this, it's under the lid. You mustn't know about it. I can't speak of it to anybody. And I remember the first time I said, my name is, and I am an alcoholic, it was a whole cathartic breakdown that I experienced, that I could barely breathe. I could barely speak. It was snot and tears everywhere. If I say that today, there isn't that charge anymore. So when I say my name is and I'm an alcoholic, I do that as an aspect of identity for the person that's sitting there that cannot say those words or cannot believe that this condition can be healed to the extent that you see someone kind of healthy and happy and living their life. So there's the ego's involvement, and you have to break the ego's like reign on that. No one can know, it cannot be admitted. And like, I'm going to say that the first word of the 12 steps is we. So we don't do this in isolation. Isolation is part of the disease process of addiction that tamas isolates. So the first word is we, but the second word is admitted, because there's this denial system, and it is the reign of the ego, and it's just sincerest methods of coping, that this is what we do. And it may not be working, but we'll come up with a better result. Like, we will make this better. And we try hundreds of ways to make the wrong idea the right idea. And so therefore, I think that it is about identification. And once we self-identify as the addict, it loses its power over us. It's like we bring it to the light. Whereas in tamas, it's like suppressed and repressed and hidden and never speak of it. Which a lot of our like codependency is also, you've got a whole cast of characters that are never going to speak of it. Like, we're all going to hide and deny the fact that this is happening. So it's an interesting thing because it's a collective thing. Yeah.
No, I love that. It's a beautiful journey. And I think that, the yoga of recovery, either with or without the 12 steps, is, I think really guiding people to a really true healing. And I'm really grateful for the work you're doing. And I'll definitely send folks your way. The book, guys, is The Yoga of Recovery by Durga Leela. Durga, can you just let us know how people can get in touch with you for more information?
Yeah, gladly. So there's a website, yogaofrecovery.com. And my email is Durga, Durga, at yogaofrecovery.com. And I want to say that you're welcome to come in and find out what we're about. So we do register for free second Saturday of the month class every month. So you can come in and just get a glimpse of the sort of conversation that we're having. And it is called Yoga of Recovery and not Yoga for Recovery, because it's pointing out that the principles and practices within the multiple recovery pathways that are available are paralleling the principles and practices of the Vedic knowledge of both yoga and Ayurveda. So a lot of people think yoga is a physical practice on the mat, and therefore it's a yoga class for people in recovery. But this is all the aspects of what we call creative self-inquiry and embodied healing. So an embodied experience of recovery. So we bring practical, daily, simple routines into a way of becoming more subtle and more intuitive and more connected with each other and our deeper self.
Brilliant, really brilliant. Durga, thank you. We're out of time, and I just want to thank you again for the work you're doing. And I think we know mental health issues are just so prevalent these days. And I think you're really providing a solution that will take them to a life of real happiness, contentment, and joy, as opposed to just, putting a symptom at bay. Is really what Ayurveda yoga can bring. So I'm so super grateful for the work you're doing, and we'll definitely send folks your way. And if anybody's listening and you have someone that you know who's struggling, this is a really good book to get started. And then you can contact Durga for more information and get help that your loved ones need. So thank you so much for being here, and hopefully we'll talk soon. Talk again.
Thank you. Namaste.
Bye. Namaste.
Do you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe and share.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at lifespa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.